In 1945, the guns of World War II finally fell silent. But Europe was in ruins. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Berlin, Warsaw, Vienna turned into ghost towns. Millions homeless. Hunger stalked the streets. And winter was coming. Across the continent, factories lay in ashes. Railways were broken. Crops had failed. In France and Italy, food riots erupted. In Germany, people traded cigarettes for bread. More than 70 million lives had been lost. And now the survivors faced another enemy, chaos. And as Western Europe stumbled in the dark, a new shadow crept from the east. The Soviet Union, untouched by Marshal's words, seized Eastern Europe quickly. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, gone behind the Iron Curtain. Stalin offered food and protection to desperate governments across the continent. France and Italy's communist parties surged in popularity, threatening a complete realignment of power. In the midst of this crisis, one man stepped forward, not with soldiers but with strategy. His name was George C. Marshal, U.S. Secretary of State, and on June 5, 1947, standing at a podium at Harvard University, he delivered a 12-minute speech that would change the world. Our policy is not directed against any country, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. George C. Marshall. That single speech became the blueprint for one of the most ambitious recovery efforts in history, the Marshall Plan. Over the next 4 years, the United States would send more than $13 billion, equal to over $165 billion today, to 16 shattered European countries. But this wasn't just charity. It was strategy. Every dollar rebuilt cities, reopened factories, and revived trade. And in doing so, it secured America's influence over Europe for the next 100 years. This was the moment the United States stepped beyond its borders, not to conquer land, but to shape economies, alliances, and futures. Was it generosity, or was it the birth of an empire without borders? This is the story of how America rebuilt Europe and claimed the throne of the modern world. The Second World War was the most destructive conflict in human history. By the time the smoke cleared in 1945, Europe looked like a graveyard of civilization. Entire cities lay in ashes, reduced to twisted steel and broken stone. In Germany, over 7.5 million people were dead. Berlin, a once great capital, was split in two, bombed into oblivion. Families used bathtubs to collect rain because pipes no longer worked. France, though a victor, had lost more than 500,000 lives, and its economy was barely functional. In Italy, some cities existed without electricity for months after the war ended. The United Kingdom, though unoccupied, was buried in debt, owing over $20 billion in war loans. Mostly to the U.S. rationing of basics like tea and meat continued until the early 1950s. Austria was divided among Allied powers. Poland had lost nearly 20% of its population. And Greece was on the brink of civil war between communist rebels and Western-backed forces. Europe wasn't just rebuilding, it was trying to survive. Millions of people were living in refugee camps. Food shortages were everywhere. In 1946, a brutal winter killed tens of thousands across France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Bread had to be rationed. Potatoes were fed to livestock because there weren't enough storage facilities. Factories had no fuel. Steel output in France was less than half of its pre-war levels. And into this desperation came political chaos. In nations like Italy and France, communist parties were growing rapidly, backed by money, propaganda, and secret support from the Soviet Union. Moscow offered an alternative: reject the West and ally with the red flag. Choose socialism over starvation. Choose revolution over recovery. Americans had won the war militarily, but now they faced a new battle. One fought not with tanks or planes, but food, dollars, and ideology. And that's when Washington realized something critical. You can't win peace on a battlefield. You win it in the bakeries, shipping yards, and factory floors of defeated nations. And from that urgency came the Marshall Plan. On June 5, 1947, graduates at Harvard University expected a typical ceremony speech. But what they heard that morning would change the future of Europe and the world. The speaker was a quiet, commanding figure. a man not known for grand gestures or political posturing. He was a former five-star general, the man who coordinated Allied armies through World War II. His name was George Catlett Marshall, and less than a year earlier, President Harry Truman had made him Secretary of State, respected by Democrats and Republicans alike. Even Churchill once called him the true organizer of victory. Not a politician, not a profiteer. He brought trust. As the summer sun warmed the Harvard yard, Marshall avoided drama or exaggeration. No political jabs, no flags waving, just facts. Europe's requirements for the next 3 or 4 years are so much greater than her present ability to pay that she must have substantial additional help, or face economic, social, and political deterioration of a very grave character. Marshall didn't just offer aid, he offered a framework. Not forced, not imposed, but he made it clear, Europe must come together to recover together. The United States would supply the tools, but Europe must do the building. To the world, this was astonishing generosity. A former enemy was offering to rebuild both allies and defeated nations, including Germany. But behind the goodwill was a strategic calculation. The United States knew it couldn't survive economically if Europe failed. American factories needed buyers. American farmers needed customers. And communism? It was spreading like wildfire. In less than 5 years, communist parties grew rapidly in France, Italy, and Greece. The Soviet Union was tapping into hunger, fear, and poverty. Marshall's speech wasn't just an invitation, it was a challenge to those choosing freedom and those tempted by dictatorship. The press didn't grasp all of it that day, but in the Kremlin, Stalin got the message loud and clear, and he didn't like what he heard. This speech would lead to billions of dollars in American aid, unity among Western nations, and one of the deepest divisions in modern history. This was the quiet beginning of the Cold War. By 1948, the Marshall Plan was no longer a speech, it was a machine. A massive, organized, international effort designed not just to donate money, but to restart the very engine of Western civilization. Congress approved $3 billion, that's over $165 billion in today's money, to be distributed across 16 European nations. And every dollar had a purpose. Receipt breakdown of U.S. aid from 1948 to 1952. Country amount received. United Kingdom $3.3 billion. France $2.3 billion. West Germany $1.4 billion. Italy $1.2 billion. Netherlands $1.0 billion. Greece $700 million. Austria $470 million. Belgium plus Luxembourg $777 million. Others including Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Turkey, etc. $3.0 billion factories in France resumed steel production. In the Netherlands, engineers rebuilt ports and canals. Austria restored hydroelectric plants. In West Germany, something incredible happened. A ruined and divided country sparked what historians call the economic miracle. ERP funds were used to purchase American locomotives, harvesters, and food reserves. But this wasn't a handout, it was a contract. To receive aid, nations had to submit economic recovery plans, cooperate with neighboring countries, promote free markets and private enterprise, and open up to U.S. imports and influence. That's where the real genius lay. Nearly 60% of Marshall Plan aid was spent on goods made in the United States, then shipped back across the Atlantic. America's factories boomed. Shipping jobs exploded. U.S. companies like Ford, Caterpillar, General Electric, and Coca-Cola expanded into brand new, war-torn markets. For every $5 spent by America, $3 came right back. In 1948, the European nations formed the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the OEC, to manage aid. That cooperation would later evolve into the European Union. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild cities, it built institutions, policies, and partnerships that last to this day. Europe recovered, stronger, faster, more united than anyone thought possible. But remember, every ton of coal, every truckload of grain, every rebuilt bridge came stamped with a flag, made in America. Behind the generosity stood a rising empire. And now, the eyes in Moscow were watching closely. In the East, one man was watching the Marshall Plan unfold. And he wasn't applauding. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, saw the Marshall Plan not as kindness but as a Trojan horse. A capitalist scheme disguised as aid. A weapon of influence. To Stalin, this wasn't reconstruction, it was economic imperialism. An attempt by the United States to bind Europe to the dollar, to capitalism, and to American military power. When Marshall first proposed his plan in June 1947, the invitation was open to all European nations, including those in the East, so long as they cooperated in creating a unified recovery plan. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and others under Soviet influence expressed interest. Even Stalin appeared momentarily intrigued. But just days later, Stalin completely reversed course. He summoned Eastern European leaders to Moscow, furious, accusing them of betrayal. He warned that accepting Marshall Plan aid meant surrendering to American control. One by one, the Eastern Bloc countries backed out. The doors to Western aid were slammed shut, not by choice but by pressure. The Cold War line had been drawn, not with tanks, but with dollars. In response, Stalin created his own version of the Marshall Plan, the Molotov Plan, named after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. Named after the same man who called Marshall's speech dollar diplomacy and toxic to sovereignty. The Molotov Plan promised economic aid and trade agreements between the USSR and its satellite states, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. But unlike the Marshall Plan, this aid didn't rebuild, it controlled. Factory blueprints from Moscow, equipment from Soviet industries. Ideological obedience was the price. USSR propaganda posters against Western influence. Footage of Soviet-aligned leaders shaking hands with Molotov or Stalin. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon, was established in 1949. It became the Soviet answer to the OEC and later the EU. But there was one major difference. The West rebuilt prosperity. The East rebuilt loyalty. By 1949, Europe was no longer just recovering, it was split. Two spheres, two ideologies, two futures. West Germany was rising, fueled by Marshall dollars. East Germany stagnated, dragged down by Soviet control and reparations. The Marshall Plan had succeeded, but it had also provoked a Cold War that would last for half a century. The battle lines weren't drawn on maps. They were drawn in supply chains, wheat shipments, factory smoke, and ideology. The Marshall Plan built Western Europe. The Soviet reaction built the divide. And from this moment on, the world would live in the shadow of two empires. The cargo ships stopped sailing. The funds stopped flowing. But the impact of the Marshall Plan never left Europe. By 1952, the last dollar of Marshall aid had been spent. In just 4 years, $13.3 billion had reignited the economies of 16 nations, created new alliances, and helped millions rise from rubble to recovery. But the plan's true power was never just in the money, it was in what it built next. Birth of the Transatlantic Alliance. The Marshall Plan bound the fortunes of the United States and Western Europe together, economically, politically, and ideologically. In 1949, those same nations united again under a military alliance. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a direct response to Soviet aggression and the Iron Curtain's shadow. America was not just an ally now, it was the architect of the post-war order. To coordinate U.S. aid, Marshall Fund recipients had to work together, leading to the formation of the OEC, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. This cooperation grew into deeper integration, the common market, the European Economic Community, and eventually the European Union. A united Europe didn't begin in Brussels. It began with boxes of flour, steel tools, and American credit. The blueprint of soft power. More than a recovery plan, the Marshall Plan became a model of soft power, influence through development instead of domination. Countries that rebuilt with American aid mostly stayed capitalist, democratic, and aligned with Washington through the Cold War and beyond. It wasn't a gift, it was a strategy. And it worked. Return on investment. The economic empire begins. America didn't just lose money, it made opportunity. Marshall Plan money returned as trade deals, export sales, and strategic partnerships. By the mid-1950s, U.S. exports to Europe grew by over 30%. American brands like General Motors, Ford, Coca-Cola, and IBM spread across Europe. The U.S. dollar became not just a currency, but a signal of global dominance. In recent decades, the echoes of the Marshall Plan returned. Blue Square after the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. rebuilt Eastern Europe with aid and trade. Yellow Square after COVID-19, the European Union launched a similar package, the Next Generation EU Fund. And today, as Ukraine defends itself against Russian invasion, world leaders are discussing a new reconstruction effort. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild a continent. It redrew borders, reshaped economies, gave birth to alliances, and ensured the rise of the American century. It was aid, yes, but it was also ambition, architecture, an empire. And to this day, every free vote, every new job, every peaceful transfer of power in Western Europe carries the silent echo of a plan once signed in Washington. This was the Marshall Plan, and this is the world it left behind.